Senator Richard C. Shelby and his colleagues met with members of the Russian Federation Council last week in Moscow. Credit Yuri Kadabnov, Agence France Presse, Getty Images B. Nicholas Fandos and Andrew E. Kramer, Washington. Even for an era of strained relations, the images that crossed back over the Atlantic last week stood out. 7 Republican senators and 1 Republican congresswoman ushered into a Moscow conference room, exchanging pleasantries with top Russian officials on the eve of American Independence Day. But if the delegation was intended to help thaw friction between the two countries before a summit meeting between their two leaders, its aftermath has shown just how treacherous diplomacy between Washington and Moscow has become amid Russia's brazen aggression abroad. In Moscow, the senators have been portrayed as anything from peacemakers to fools. Democrats in Washington were only slightly more generous. It is clear to me that there are members of the Senate who are either naive or they don't recognize the real risk factors that Russia imposes on our system of government, said Senator Benjamin L. Cardin, Democrat of Maryland, who led a report on Vladimir V. Putin's tactical aggression in Europe this year. Russian commentators and officials, meanwhile, claimed that the senators' overtures were evidence that the tide of United States-Russian relations were, in fact, moving toward the Kremlin just as President Trump prepared to meet privately with Mr. Putin, the Russian president. The wind is blowing in our sails. Vyacheslav Nikonov, the chairman of the State Duma Education Committee, told a Russian state television talk show after meeting with the delegation. The multi-day trip, with stops in St. Petersburg and Moscow, amounted to the most senior congressional exchange between the two countries in years, and the first since the Russians undertook an unprecedented and consequential campaign to bolster Donald J. Trump's presidential campaign and harm Hillary Clinton's. That interference remains the subject of high-stakes investigations in the United States, and it loomed over the trip. On the same day the senators met with officials in Moscow, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a report confirming that conclusions reached by American intelligence agencies, that Mr. Putin ordered a campaign to sow American political divisions, harm Mrs. Clinton and aid Mr. Trump, were sound. Its release was intended to drive home that Russia is still active in American politics, using digital tools to deepen the country's social divisions. In Moscow, the senators traded pledges to work toward better relations with Russian lawmakers and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. But they repeatedly found themselves locked in tense disputes over the effects of American sanctions and Russian denials that they had meddled in American politics. Senator Richard C. Shelby, Republican of Alabama, who led the delegation and is chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, greeted the officials by saying that though two nations were competitors, they don't necessarily need to be adversaries. I'm not here today to accuse Russia of this or that or so forth, he told Vyacheslav V. Volodin, the Duma speaker. Russian officials and commentators signaled that they were delighted with that tone. They declared that they had ceded no ground to the Americans. We heard things we'd heard before, and I think our guests heard rather clearly and distinctly an answer that they already knew. We don't interfere in American elections, said Sergei I. Kislyak, Russia's former ambassador to the United States and a player in the election investigations, according to the Washington Post. Maxim Suchkov, a foreign policy expert with ties to the foreign ministry, told the RBC newspaper that the delegation's visit aimed to bring the Republican Party into line on the importance of dialogue with Russia, a policy supported by Mr. Nikonov described the American senators as Trumpists, who have taken firmly anti-Russian positions yet are open to dialogue. Back in Washington this week, the senators were left to distance themselves from charges that they had allowed themselves to be used as props by a government hostile to American interests, particularly at a time set aside to commemorate American democracy. Comments by one of them, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, set off howls from Democrats. Mr. Johnson, the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, returned to Washington questioning the value of punitive American sanctions targeting Russian financial interest and urging his fellow senators to reconsider how to best discourage Russian interference. I've been pretty upfront that the election interference, as serious as that was, and unacceptable, is not the greatest threat to our democracy. Mr. Johnson said in an interview with the Washington Examiner. We've blown it way out of proportion, Mr. Johnson was forced to clean up his remarks on Tuesday, saying that the senators had delivered a stern warning to Moscow and that the Russians would regret their disparaging comments toward American lawmakers. Mr. Shelby, too, sounded a more skeptical note back at the Capitol. He and almost all other senators voted on Tuesday to advance a largely symbolic measure meant to reaffirm the United States' commitment to NATO amid threats by Mr. Trump and to call on the administration to develop a comprehensive strategy to blunt Russian aggression. My advice to the president would be careful, he told reporters. You are dealing with a tough man, a smart man, and he probably wants to get something and give nothing in return. The episode could serve as something of a cautionary tale for Mr. Trump's own long-delayed summit meeting with Mr. Putin next Monday. Mr. Trump signaled on Tuesday as he departed for a week-long visit with European allies that he was looking forward to a meeting with Mr. Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Mr. Trump said. A version of this article appears in print on page A12 of the New York edition with the headline, Trip to Moscow by GOP Senators Shows Bitterness of Relations. Or to reprints today's paper, subscribe.